Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of the upcoming Crime Syndicate miniseries. Or actually, I guess it's going to come out right before this. So the just released Crime Syndicate miniseries at DC Comics, the founder of the online comic school Comics Experience, and a former editor of a whole bunch of comics at Variant Publishers. It's Andy Schmidt. Thanks for coming on, Andy.
It's good to be here, David. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing?
Oh, you know, it's another day that blends into all the other days.
You know, it's funny. You're in Kentucky. I'm in Alaska. It's funny when we started talking about Kentucky. I don't remember what it was, but I read this article. Do you know who Steve Zahn is?
Yes.
Steve Zahn apparently lives in Kentucky also and has like this big farm there. I'm like, that's just basically what I imagine everybody who moves to Kentucky's life is like. It's just like their day life where they're doing their day job, but the rest of it is just farming and hanging out in Kentucky. Probably wildly inaccurate.
Not that inaccurate. I mean, I think the only thing you missed was the bourbon.
Oh, the bourbon.
There's bourbon throughout all of those activities. For some people, even sleeping.
I just imagine that would be mostly in Lexington, but maybe I'm being too hyper-local when it comes to Kentucky activities.
You think the bourbon's only in Lexington? Oh, no. It's throughout, yeah. Well, the distilleries, like there's actually a thing called the Bourbon Trail, which is really cool. And it's like all these different distilleries that you can go and like do tours of and all this kind of stuff. And the distilleries are kind of clustered together. Like there's a bunch out by Bardstown. There are some over by Lexington. You know, Buffalo Trace is in Frankfurt. And there's some in Louisville. So it really, you know, and then there's a lot that are out just kind of like in what seemingly in the middle of nowhere, which is a lot of Kentucky. But yeah, I mean, and the bourbons, you know, it goes through here because of the limestone in Kentucky. There's a common misconception about bourbon that it can only be distilled in Kentucky. That the misconception is that if you can distill the same product in another location, but because if it wasn't in Kentucky, it's not bourbon, and that's not true. Thing is that all bourbons are whiskey, but not all whiskeys are bourbon.
Well, I'll tell you what, all bourbons I do not like because it's too intense for me. It like basically tastes like fire. And I also had a bad experience in college that resulted in a let's say a taste aversion to it. But the funny thing though is my problem with bourbon drinks isn't that I don't like them, it's that they're all so cool and I don't like them. Like old fashions, very cool drink. I can't drink them though because they're disgusting and I want it.
I mean, it sounds like you don't like it because of the taste, which I think is a fair thing. It's not for everybody. Bourbon was like when I was in college, bourbon was my sort of like liquor of choice. And that was before I ever lived in Kentucky. And then I moved to Kentucky and I really wasn't thinking about it all that much. And then I moved here and I was like, ooh, I like bourbon.
That's destiny.
In the right place. Yeah, it was destiny, wasn't it?
The Bourbon Trail sounds like a really intense version of going like to vineyards in California. Like sipping
it's
some wine.
Idea, really.
Yeah, but I mean, sipping wine versus sipping bourbon, it's just like, whew. I feel like that is a massive difference. But anyways, we could go into bourbon forever. I do want to talk about your intro, which is one of the rare times I found myself correcting myself as I was giving it. And I think that comes part and parcel with the fact that your credits, like your comic life, is like perhaps more all over the place than, I don't know, basically anyone. You've had a lot of hats in your career. What's up with that?
Yeah. Well, it comes down to the fact that I like doing new things and I like learning and I like, and I like working with good people, you know, people that I like and that are creative. And so I've found all these different ways to do that, to keep learning, but then also to keep working with often some of the same people, but often, you know, new creative people. And I mean, it's funny you bring this up because I literally just had this conversation with my agent and manager in Los Angeles because I do stuff out there too. And they were setting up a call with me and somebody at Universal Studios and they were like, and we have the hardest time like talking about you and like explaining why you're a person they should be talking to, because like, are you editorial? Are you a creative consultant? Are you a producer? Are you, and like, I've done all those things, right? I'm a writer. I'm somebody that, hey, they want to start a small publishing program. Like, you should talk to this guy. Oh, I thought he was a screenwriter, or I thought he was a whatever. So yes, I wear many hats, and I actually wear probably more hats than even you realize, because about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, and I had no intention of doing this. This was not like a thing I set out to do, but like, I started a printing company.
Yeah.
Because have we talked about this?
We when we walked around at New York Comic Con, you told me about it.
Yeah. So
you did the Noctera Kickstarter, right?
Yeah, we did. We printed that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful book. It is wonderful. And yeah, and it was like we printed the super cool like classic Dreadstar collection, this 3-volume collection in a slipcase. It's awesome. But yeah, I mean, I didn't set out to start another company, but now I have like 4 or 5 companies now that I run. And then I do like freelance stuff on top of it, it sounds insane. And my wife tells me that it is. So I just like doing new things. I like working with people. So my point about the printing company is that I started that because I was, like you were saying, we were walking around at shows, and I talked to my friends, and I talked to some smaller and medium-sized publishers, and they were all, paying more than I thought they should be for printing, and it just makes it harder for anybody, on the creative side to make any money. And so I started having conversations, because over the years I made connections with a couple of printers, and next thing I know, I'm getting discounted rates for people and stuff like that. And then I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm able to help, some friends out and stuff. And then it became like it was taking up hours of my day every day. And then I made a deal with a really great printer, and now, the pricing that if people go through me, they get discounted pricing overall, because I'm bringing a bulk amount of jobs to the printer. But I don't have to add like a premium on top of that. So it's like a profit split sort of thing. So even if you were to go directly to that printer with the amount of volume I had, you still wouldn't get a better rate than you do through us. So once that deal kind of got made, and I knew that there was no reason for somebody to kind of leapfrog over me and like go directly to the printer, and this printer, like, they're awesome. They're so good, and they see everything that we do as a partnership. And anytime I've, one of my clients has had a problem, like, they're always right there with me to help, figure it out and make things right. And which does not happen very often, I should mention, but It does happen. I mean, you're shipping literally tons of things, like, around the world at times, and so some things do happen. But like that, like I said, like, I never set out to do that, but then, like, it's 2 years later, and I'm like, I have this whole skill set now of like logistics and shipping and like how things get packed up, and like, it's crazy.
I do think it's kind of funny that people who write comics often say, like, oh, you know what, people should learn about the other parts of making comics, and they're typically referring to like drawing comics and like lettering comics and things like that. And you took that to like the nth degree. You're like, time to learn about teaching at an online comic school, time to learn about printing comics. And just like every single one is just like, okay, Andy, we get it, you got a lot of hats, calm down.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird, but it is true though that with everything, every new sort of endeavor, and I don't turn everything I do into a full business, but but yeah, with everything that I do that I learn, like, I think it just makes me better at all of it, right?
Yeah.
One of the reasons why the printing business has taken off as quickly as it has is because creators know that I've been there, right? Like, I've been in their shoes, so they can call me up and they can, like, we can talk about artsy stuff. We can talk about how fans react to things. Sometimes I even give a little editorial advice while I'm on the phone with them, and so it's just, I think there's a comfort level with me, for a lot of folks that works. But yeah, you are absolutely right. I have done a ton of stuff, but my career, the focus of my career has always been on story and character. So, yeah.
Well, so we're going to get into all that, but I want to kind of path a little bit through the specifics. But I want to start at the beginning, because obviously you probably weren't 6 and you're like, you know what? when I get older, I'm going to own 4 different businesses and I'm going to have all these different things. You probably were, there was probably some inkling that you wanted to get into comics at some point. How did you decide that you wanted to get into the comics world in some sort of capacity?
Well, certainly when I was a kid. I have 2 older brothers, and we grew up reading comics, and we would pass them between us because we very early on. I was born, and for the first several years of my life, at least to the point where I was reading anyway. We lived in essentially the mountains of West Virginia, and there wasn't a whole lot, but there was basically a used bookstore, but they got comics, and that became my brother's and my sort of jam. Actually, a kid down the street gave my eldest brother what was at that time basically a complete run of Wolfman Perez New Teen Titans.
Oh wow.
I mean, they were still doing the book, but it was like the first 30 something issues probably, or something like that. And I think we had already been reading comics, but then that it exploded. And then my other brother got super into X-Men, like Claremont Byrne X-Men stuff, and then I just read whatever they bought. But that was the 3 of us. That was our weekly ritual. Our parents would let us, I don't know what they were thinking, but they would let us walk down to the store and buy older comics. And he didn't throw his comics out that came on the newsstand. He would keep them, and he kept these boxes. And it turns out, I mean, I learned this much later, long after we moved away, that he was really a comics fan, and he really liked having us come in. And I guess there were others too, but he wasn't going to make a living in this small town known for pepperoni rolls, making on a comic store. And that comic shop is still there. It's changed ownership. It's called, I think it's called Comics Paradise Plus. And yeah, I mean, it was just cool. He liked having us down there, and we got to dig into stuff, and it was great. So but that was what, and then I was oh, I want to be a comic book artist. And then, those things fade over time. I kept reading, but then when I was in college, I was a freshman in college, and one of my brothers again said, hey, he was looking at for a summer internship sort of thing. And he was going through this giant phone book sort of thing, and saw that Marvel Comics had an internship program. And he was still reading comics too, but he wasn't that interested in doing that, maybe for a living. And I flounder a lot. And so he was he told me about it. He was Marvel has this internship, you should do that. So, I didn't feel like doing research to find something else I wanted to do. That seemed like work. And so I applied for the Marvel internship, and then I got really excited about it and flew up there. And so I was up there for the summer of 1997, and I worked between 2 offices. I was 3 days a week in one office and 2 days a week in the other. And that was when I realized that being an editor seemed super cool to me. Mm-hmm. Because you got to work on a bunch of stuff, and you got to work with all of these cool creators. And I wasn't sure how much I wanted to write. I've always loved writing, and in college I wrote and directed and produced my own short, terrible films. But I wasn't sure that I wanted to do that for a living. What I tell people is I don't want to write for food. I like writing, but it's a thing that I want to do because I love doing it, not because it's paying my bills.
Right.
So yeah, that's what really convinced me that I wanted to edit comics. But then I had to go back. I finished school, and then I got a master's degree in St. Louis. And when I was getting my master's degree, because I had to write a giant, 150, 200 page master's thesis, I realized pretty early on it was going to be about comics. And so I spent 2 years focusing on comics, sort of from an academic perspective, and wrote my thesis, turned my thesis in.
What was it about?
It was about kind of marketing in comics.
Okay.
But it dove into the history of how comics have been marketed, and trends, and all this kind of stuff. My degree technically is in media communications with an emphasis in marketing and advertising, but I worked in advertising for 2 weeks. It's terrible.
I still work in advertising. It can be terrible. Don't fire me, boss.
Right. Yeah. Hey, you should probably strike that from the podcast. You might want to delete that.
No, I'm not worried about it.
but yeah, so then I was like doing this academic thing, and actually when I was getting my master's degree, I wound up talking. So I was in the master's program, which has a different department head than the undergraduate, but I was taking just because I liked them. I was taking screenwriting courses in the undergraduate program, and one of them was taught by the head of the media communications department for undergrad. And I was just talking with him one day, like after class, and asked him if he'd ever thought about doing something with comics, because I knew that that was kind of resurging or maybe surging for the first time. And he said no. And then he was like, why don't you write a proposal? And so the first comics class I ever taught was at Webster University in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. And I wound up teaching 2 or 3 classes for them. This was super fun. I created a Stanley Kubrick class that I taught at the community college in St. Louis.
That's awesome.
Really, really enjoyed that. That was awesome. But yeah, but then the whole time, like I'm doing all this stuff. And so I've got 2 years where I'm working on this master's thesis. And so I kind of designed it in a way that it gave me like a reason to be reaching out to comics creators and comics companies and comics editors. And so it was a lot easier back then to actually call places and actually get connected to them. That's harder and harder to do. But I would call places or email somebody and say, I am writing a thesis paper, and I would like to interview you for X, Y reason or whatever. And the return rate on that of people that actually would set up interviews, either over email or over the phone, was I realized I don't think I was that astonished at the time, but looking back on it now knowing like what the return rate on that is, it was pretty astonishing. So I was interviewing like Denny O'Neil, Barry Windsor Smith. I had a phone interview with Joe Quesada. I've got people in the marketing department, all these other, all these awesome creators and stuff. And I didn't really think of it this way, but like I was kind of building a network in a way. So yeah, and then when there was a job opening that Chris Girusso told me about, he was working in Marvel's bullpen at the time. I applied for it, and I wasn't doing any drugs, so I passed the drug test. And they're like, "That's the guy." So yeah, I started working
at Marvel Editorial.
Yeah, as an assistant editor for Tom Brevoort.
So I'm curious. All right, so your agent is like, "What the hell is this guy? How do I describe him?" When you're thinking about like what you really like, if you had to choose one of your hats, would it be editorial? Is that like kind of your favorite hat? Or can you even have a favorite hat?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I really like about editorial is that in that role you get to wear a lot of different hats.
Right, exactly. Because you're helping with story, you're helping depending on the publisher, you're helping guide the line. You're looking through art and giving notes, all lettering, etc. I mean, it's editorial in some ways. It's not comics experience, your online comic school, but it is kind of a crash course in understanding comics, I imagine.
Yeah, it is, and that's what going to work at Marvel was like. Okay, kid, here you go. Here's the deep end of the pool, and then they like kind of kick you into it, and then you figure things out, hopefully fast enough to not get fired. And I was pretty close to getting fired, I think multiple times in like my first 6 months. And I'm not saying that to like disparage anybody at Marvel, but just like, I mean, there was just so much being thrown at you so fast, and then you make mistakes, and and Marvel was in a very weird spot at that point. They were still in bankruptcy, and there was
this like 2004?
This was 2002.
2002. Okay.
So Joe was already editor in chief, but the transition hadn't fully happened. So like there were like literally there were going away parties like every Friday. Mm-hmm. And then then occasionally new people would come in, but it was the perfect time in a very big way to come in to Marvel editorial, because myself and Nick Lowe and Warren Simons and Mackenzie Cadenhead and all of us that came in during this sort of like basically 1 year period had opportunities that just don't exist right now. And the reason for that is that Marvel got out of bankruptcy, stabilizes, becomes this big thing, and now it's part of Disney. And I'm not saying that in like that stuff is bad sort of a way, but the business has stabilized it in a way that it's takes much longer for a junior person to rise through the ranks, and they're just not given, and there's more sort of systems in place that says, you have to be this rank to get this sort of project and blah, blah, blah. It was more like a free for all when I got there.
Right.
And so for us on the younger side or the newer side, it was like, if you saw an opening to get in on a cool project, you went for it.
Right.
Right. And in fact, Bill Jemis was president at the time. And he was just like, we don't have enough staff for all this to have only 4 full editors or senior editors or whatever they were called at the time. And so he just decreed one day, I think it was him, maybe it was a larger conversation, but he was kind of the one that announced it, was like, every assistant editor, no matter how long they've been here, has to have 2 books that they directly edit, which as far as I know had never happened at Marvel before. So I think I was maybe there 3 months, 4 months, something like that. And all of a sudden, my boss Tom basically told me, he was like, I had to give you 2 books. I don't want to. I don't think you're ready. And so I gave you the 2 books where you could do the least amount of damage.
Avengers and Fantastic Four.
Right. Because who could break those?
Exactly.
No, I got Spider-Girl, which had this very built-in fan base. It had a very stable creative team. Everybody on it knew what the book was and whatever. So it was just like, you just kind of have to run the bases on that. Right. And then I was given Captain Marvel, which Peter David was writing at the time.
Yeah, we talked about this before, the Genisfeld stuff.
Yeah, right after they relaunched it and with Criss Cross and all that sort of stuff. And then very quickly after that, I found out that Spider-Girl was being canceled with issue 67, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, well, I gotta get sales up. And so I wound up doing, I think, a pretty good job on Spider-Girl because I practically doubled sales. I say I don't want to like belittle
you and the team,
like Tom DeFalco or Ron Frenz was the artist at the time, but the reason that sales went up was because I pretty much demanded that we put Spider-Girl in the Venom costume.
Oh.
The 75th issue cover. So it's an all white cover with just her in the black costume on the cover. And the team was actually kind of resistant to do it. And I was like, this is the only way to save this book. So we're going to do this. And then you guys figure out how to make it work in the story. I mean, it wasn't quite like that, but we did that. And sure enough, sales spiked, rescued the book. And the story that I commissioned as originally as I think it was it may have been 57. No, it wouldn't have been 57. As 67 was, no, that's not right. That can't be right because this was for the 75th issue. Anyway, maybe it was commissioned as 83 or something like
Somewhere.
That. It was kind of a random. Yeah, it was kind of a random number. Anyway, that one that we started on got bumped back, and the book wound up lasting to 100 issues, which is pretty cool. Like that's very rare that happens. That you're able to kind of rescue a book like that. And obviously Tom and Ron did a great job with what they were doing on it. But that was sort of my first thing of like, oh, I'm starting to understand how editors can actually really affect sales. And while I was having seemingly a good effect on sales on Spider-Girl, I was managing Captain Marvel to death on the other side, which was the book that I actually like read and really liked, like from almost like a fan perspective on. And I wound up kind of driving that book into the ground, and it got canceled. So I had like one success and one like thing where I'm like, oh, I did something really good, and I was able to actually like boost sales over here. Oh, and then, but it was my fault that one failed.
I've been wondering for decades who to blame for that. Now I know.
Yeah, no, it's me. It's me. 100% me. But that was also a super good learning experience because I realized that you can't edit everyone the same way.
Right.
And the way I was working with Peter was not helping Peter. I was kind of handcuffing him. The way that he works is really organic, and he discovers a lot about his characters and about the story that he's telling as he's writing it. It's a very organic process. And I was trying to get him to outline everything like in pretty good detail because I needed to know how are we going to market 6 months from now and all this sort of stuff. And by the end of that run on Captain Marvel, he and I had figured out how to work together well, but it was too late to save that to save that book. But so what we wound up doing was we would talk about characters. Where are these characters going to go, and what's going to happen with the characters? What emotional journey are they going to go on? So it wasn't plot stuff really at all. I'd sometimes I wouldn't know who the villain would be, but I would know what he wanted to do, what he wanted to challenge the characters with. And so that was enough to evaluate scripts as they were coming in and going like, yeah, this is what we talked about. Well, this is cool. He's using Blastar, or he's using whatever. So we got to a point where we really enjoyed working together, and then the book got canceled, but then that allowed us to pitch doing Madrox miniseries, which led to relaunching X Factor, so we wound up coming out ahead in the end, from Marvel's perspective. But
Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick second to give a shout out to my friends at Bad Idea. You may have heard of this experimental new comic book publisher. They're the crew that debuted recently in select comic shops worldwide with Matt Kint and Doug Braithwaite's ENIAC #1. And they did that a little differently than their peers. First, each issue is oversized and ad-free. Second, each issue comes with a bonus B-side story, giving readers a little something extra with each issue. Lastly, and this is the wild part, so listen up, they don't publish variants, trades, or digital versions of their comics, so if you want one or all of them, you better get to the Bad Idea retailer near you and be there on a Wednesday. Don't have one near you? Order online or explore your options for mail order at badideacorp.com to make sure you don't miss out on ENIAC or upcoming titles from creators like Zeb Wells, David LaFuente, Marguerite Bennett, and many more. And now, back to the show. I do think, so you were there from, seems like roughly 2002 to 2008, and then you went on to IDW. And like, we could go into detail about Annihilation, I'm sure, but at the same time, we did an entire oral history about that. But I do think that time is a really interesting one for comics in general. Like I had Brian Michael Bendis on the podcast last year, and I remember talking to him about him going in like 1999, 2000 or something like that. And he was like, yeah, they were like literally rolling out filing cabinets because it seemed like it was the end. And he's like, am I writing like the last Marvel stories? And I mean, that provides a lot of opportunity for a lot of creativity and risk taking. Yeah. And it is interesting because that whole stretch had some really, like, I actually think that the aughts in Marvel is probably the strongest creative stretch for the publisher ever. And I mean, it's interesting. Like, it's like you did Annihilation, you did X Factor, you edited Brubaker on Captain America too, right?
I was part of the team.
Part of the team, yeah.
Tom was the head editor, and I was the, I think, associate editor on that. But right. Yeah, I was definitely involved. Yes. And then you moved on to IDW, did a bunch of great stuff there too. But I'm interested in like, which projects do you feel like you learned the most on about making good comics? I'm not asking you to play favorites, just like a learning. Yeah. No, from a learning perspective, definitely those first two that I was lead editor on, and I was grateful that Tom was looking over my shoulder. Like I wasn't just like completely off in the middle of nowhere. But I learned a ton on those, obviously, because they were the first ones I was head editor on. Secret War, the Brian Bendis and Gabrielle Dell'Otto series. I learned a lot working on that one.
What was it about that one?
Gabe at the time hadn't done a lot of sequential work. He was known as a painter, like more of an illustration painter. He'd done some, but he also had a very, very European storytelling style, which is significantly different from the American style, and this needed to be in the American style. So I worked with him a lot on layouts. I've got all of these, he would turn in, penciled layouts, and then we'd go over those and restructure them and, all this sort of stuff. And it wasn't that he was doing anything wrong or poorly. It just was a different aesthetic than what the book kind of needed to be. So I learned a ton about storytelling and layout design and all this sort of stuff on that. And he and I became close friends because we were talking to each other all the time. Also, English is not his first language. So I also learned a lot about how to kind of mitigate that when you don't have a translator. His English isn't bad, but it is somewhat limited. And so there was this huge and that was the first time that I edited. I had worked on Bendis books before, but that was the first time I had edited Bendis directly. Mm-hmm. And that's great. Like I love Brian and I still chat from time to time, and I mean, we haven't worked together, I don't think, since I left Marvel, so I learned a lot on that one for sure. Annihilation, I learned a ton on. Civil War, I learned a ton on. Those skills don't apply to a lot of what I do now because I'm not running like events with multiple series that tie in with each other. I'm not doing that a whole lot anymore.
Imagine deadlines though, and just managing the workflow and everything like that. That's, even if it's not applicable in terms of size, it's like, it's kind of like once you can do that, almost I don't want to say it seems easy comparatively, but it is relatively easy comparatively when you don't have like, I don't know, what was it for Annihilation? Prologue, 4 miniseries that lead in, plus Drax, and then the main book, and then 2 or 3 books afterwards, the Heralds.
Two double sized.
2 double sized, yeah. So that's, I mean, it's just like from a size standpoint, not comparable, but spinning plates, probably comparable.
Yeah, no. Well, and here's the crazy part about that is that the office I was in, there were 4 of us. And Tom was the head, and then I was the number 2, and then I think at the time that was Aubrey and Molly, I think, were the 2 assistant editors, and definitely Molly because she was working a lot on Civil War anyway. But yeah, so at that time we had our regular 18 to 20 comics that had to go out the door just because that's what the office, when there were no events going on, that's what they would do. Annihilation was considered not like part of our group, so all of Annihilation was on top of the regular workload, and I was the head editor. I did like 90% of the work on editorial wise on Annihilation. Tom read everything and looked it over, but it was by that point, it was long after Spider-Girl and Captain Marvel. By that point, he was pretty comfortable letting me kind of do my thing, and I was the one that would, when higher ups had questions or didn't like something, I was the one that was going in and having those conversations. So that was going on, like in addition to the regular 20 books, and that was also the same time Civil War was coming out of our office.
It's a little bit of work.
So at that point, somebody in our office had to read pretty much every script from every comic going out the door from Marvel because everything tied into Civil War. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that was the most intense work thing I think I've ever experienced. I have reached time where I have worked that number of hours for fairly decent sized stretches, but not like basically doing one thing. Like we talked about before, I have several companies, so I've had very, very busy times, and I like to stay busy. But yeah, that was a lot.
Imagine it was like 168 hours a week.
Yeah, I think that's what it felt like. Yeah, it really was a lot, like to the point where like I didn't work on Annihilation very often in the office.
Yeah, I remember you telling me you're working at home.
Yeah, I was working at home a lot on that, or on the weekends and stuff and I would do that so that when I went into the office, I could concentrate on the stuff that was happening like that day. Annihilation, one of the things I learned on Annihilation, and largely because of all the other work that was going on, was how to get super organized. And so I would kind of do all this organizational stuff so that it could kind of go, like all the creators could kind of go for the week, and then I could do all the editorial on the weekend or whatever. Mm-hmm. I mean, it didn't work out quite that simplistically, but that was I was doing a lot at home just so that I could breathe when I was at the office.
So you started writing when you got to IDW, but at what point did you realize you wanted to write your own comics?
I had been writing comics for myself even before I was at Marvel, and none of that stuff got published. I didn't know people in the industry. I didn't really know how to submit stuff, and
so it was always an interest, though.
Yeah, it was an interest. I had done more sort of, I think I mentioned like I made short films and stuff in college. So writing was always there. And then when I was at Marvel, I would write some stuff, and it would be very awkward at Marvel to be like, I'm going to go pitch a book to Oni Press or, whatever. Like, it'll be a little weird. So I didn't really do that. And then when I left Marvel, I left to be a stay-at-home dad. My wife and I had our first child, and she worked in something useful to the world. So she made a lot more money. And so she was the breadwinner, and I stayed at home with our kid for the first year. and that's when I started. Right, that's when I started Comics Experience, because I was doing some teaching that I had been doing on my own, like during the last year or so. I was at Marvel through another organization, and then through MoCA, the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art, and then so then I did that as my own thing, so I could like own my own business, and I could do that at night. So my wife had come home from work because she had a 9-to-5 job in the city, and then I could go. Then she could kind of take over with our son, and I could go into the city and do the teaching. And then I had my own business that I was running. And you can't, one of the nice things about owning your own business is no one can lay you off or fire you.
Yeah.
So I'm a fan of that. So yes, that's when I started doing that. But that's also when I started writing too. Like, he'd take a nap and I'd be like, well, I can't really go anywhere. I'm stuck in this 1-bedroom apartment. So why don't I start writing? And there were some other things I did too. So yeah, I started kind of figuring out, and that wound up being really super helpful for Comics Experience, because that's when I developed a methodology for writing scripts that sort of takes script writing and can break it down into bite-sized chunks. So you can focus on this, and then you can focus on that, and then you can focus on this other thing. Because one of the most annoying things about writing is just like you pull up a Word document, or you pull up Final Draft, whatever it is you're using, and like there's just like that little blinking line. We used to call that a cursor when it was a rectangle, but like the little thing is just blinking, and it's just like taunting you, like, fill me up with story, page hungry. And you're just like, oh my God, like, how do I do this? And like, how, and with comics, I find this true with comics more so even than with film and television, that you have to think about what is the image, like what is the still image, but what's happening in it, like what is the action in that image, and then what's the dialogue that can flow over it? Like, how does this fit with the rest of the page? I have to think about like what's the most important panel on a page, like it's so much that I find it hard to just start writing script pages. You want to end each page with a question, like a hook or whatever, like, and so I created this methodology, and it's not a paint by numbers sort of thing, but I created this methodology so that I could take little bites at a time and piece it all together. And it wound up being something that I could teach to other people that was designed, and I tweaked it for teaching, and I still tweak it and add things to the course and update the course and whatnot. But for the intro to writing class that I teach, that allows someone's voice to still come through. Mm-hmm. So it's not teaching people to write like me. The world doesn't need more Andy Schmidt writers. The world needs more writers that have their own voice, have their own things to say. So we created a methodology that helps people get that, so they can get to a final script that makes sense, and they could hand to an artist and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, but that's when I decided I wanted to try my hand at writing, and I wrote a few things kind of right out of the gate. Marvel gave me 2 short stories. Don't look them up. They're awful. They are really atrocious, although one of them is beautifully illustrated by Fraser Irving. And then I did a 4-issue miniseries at Boom that summer called Challenger Deep, about a downed submarine and basically the Mariana Trench. That was really cool, and that was super fun because I got to do all this research on submarines and stuff. That was really cool. And Mark Waid was my editor on that, which was also cool because I had worked on Fantastic Four with Mark.
The tables had turned.
Yeah, I was like, this could be terrible. You could just get all this revenge on me. And there was this really funny exchange between Mark and me. After the first issue came out, I read it. I got my printed copy and I read it, and there was there's the typical, in any sort of like espionage or whatever sort of, there's the info dump scene where the guy's up there and going like, this is where the ship went down and this is your mission, and blah, blah, gives you all the stats and all that stuff. It was that scene. And I read that scene in the book, and I was like, oh, this reads pretty well. Like there's some character stuff going on. I did a better job with this than I realized. And then I realized like halfway through that scene, this is not all my dialogue.
Mark had spruced it up a little bit.
Yeah, Mark had just he dressed it up a little bit, made it a lot better. So I'm laughing about this. Like I think it's funny, right? So I emailed Mark, and email doesn't have a tone of voice on it. So I emailed Mark and like, how dare you like change my dialogue or whatever. I think I even probably said something. I never would have done that to you, or something like that. And like immediately my phone rang and he was super apologetic. And I realized that like he didn't realize that I was kidding. He thought I was really upset. And of course I wasn't at all. And I was like, dude, you can rewrite my, you're Mark Waid, rewrite my dialogue all you want. All that's ever going to do is help my career. Like, so I felt bad that I made him panic like that, but it was actually really funny. But he was great. He was great to work with. He's a great editor.
I do kind of wonder if all of this, like, your time in editorial and like doing comics experience and, all the people you met during that, like, you were talking about when you were doing your thesis, it was just like you're kind of building up this Rolodex. And, I imagine like each facet of your life, the editorial time, the comics experience time, et cetera, that's, I don't know. I think it's funny that like we start in the beginning talking about all your different hats, and it kind of, it feels like the natural result of all the different things you've done. Like you were always kind of destined to do a lot of stuff because you've always done a lot of stuff and you've always known a lot of people, and it just kind of pulls you in a bunch of different directions. I don't know. I find that interesting, like talking about this, because it feels like a natural extension of your career.
Yeah. And I will say this too, like, there are times when I think of, I love the fact too that we still use the term Rolodex. Like anybody has.
I know. I use that and I'm just like, God, do people really A, not know what that is, or B, know that I'm like too old to be doing a podcast?
Well, I feel like we'll call it a contact list. I feel like my contact list shrinks. It goes through spurts. So it'll shrink for a while because I'm just not doing much in comics. I've written several video games and stuff, and like I will happily tell you that every other facet of the entertainment industry pays better than comics. And so there is a real draw to just be able to just like leave comics behind, but like I love them. Mm-hmm. So I can't. I feel like it's like an abusive relationship. I just can't get out of. But I do love them, right? Like I love comics, and when comics are working, and when you're working with people that you trust and you get along with, it's the best kind of collaboration.
I hear that,
and I love collaborating. Now, I'm not gonna lie, like it's not always. Like you're not always working with people that you like and that you trust, and that usually especially if I get to choose the creative team, I'm working with people I like and trust. But yeah, it is a weird thing where sometimes like if I am working outside of comics for an extended period of time, which I certainly have, I feel like, oh my gosh, everybody's forgotten me. And then what I have learned is that if I go to a bunch of conventions, that I'll pick up old friendships, and I'll meet new people in comics, and it's interesting. Yeah, I'm old enough now that I go to conventions and like people are excited to see me because that I don't know. Like there'll be fans that are excited to see me because they associate me with, it's usually one of a handful of projects, but yeah, and like people come and like that still shocks me that like people are that aware of my work, especially editorial work, because I didn't think anybody ever looked at an editor's name.
I think if you're in enough books, you start recognizing people. I mean, it's like, especially in comics, maybe not like probably in book editing too, but it's just like you do enough things. I mean, like I was just looking up something really quick, and I saw I forgot, or maybe I didn't even know that you edited Son of M, a comic that I eternally rep for that no one else talks about. But I mean, that's just one of those things is like, people who are huge fans of specific books, like let's say, Brubaker's run on Captain America or Annihilation or that, it's like, it's a natural extension of that. I do want to jump into the DC stuff, and that is not jumping off of like comics to be miserable or anything like that. But I want to talk about, before we get into Crime Syndicate, your new book, when you first came to DC, I remember emailing you congratulations because you were announced as the writer of Generation 1, Age of Mysteries. And that whole thing kind of it either disappeared or at least morphed, depending on what your perspective is, because Generations Forged still came out, and I think it just came out. I am interested in like what happened there, or at least like what can you tell me about what happened? And like, did it basically just largely become Generations Forged?
It did not become Generations Shattered and Forged. It's two books. So so if you've got $20 you want to spend
There we go.
next time you go to the comic store, buy Generation Shattered and Forged, which, by the way, for your hard-earned dollar per page is still a great deal because they're both 80 pages long. But it's not like we took what the story was
And just stapled it.
and just like converted it to 280-page giants. It wasn't that at all. It really did. Are there some holdover elements or like kernels of ideas? Probably, but it's really a very different project.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it just basically evolved. But I am interested in like, you'd done a lot of different things, and you worked in Marvel at editorial, and you'd done writing elsewhere. What was the appeal of working with DC? Like, what when that opportunity presented itself, like, what made that one that you wanted to jump onto?
There's kind of the mildly funny answer. Which
I want to hear the mildly funny answer.
Well, I had literally worked on like everything that I loved as a child. I'd worked on all the Marvel heroes that I liked. I mean, I didn't really do a real run on Daredevil, but he was in Avengers for a while and stuff, so I close enough. But like, I got to work on X-Men, I got to work on Avengers and FF and all that good stuff. Spider-Man even. So, and then I went over to IDW and I got to work on my other great loves as a child, which were Transformers and G.I. Joe, and Star Trek. And then after I left IDW, I got to work on Star Wars directly through Lucas and Disney Publishing Worldwide. So I got to write a bunch of Star Wars stuff. So and I had like gotten to the point where I was like, well, I'm taking off my dream list. So I started taking off my brother's dream list of things that they would want to work with. I remember calling my brother up and be like, guess who's the new Dungeons and Dragons editor? And he was just like, I freaking hate you. So when I started talking with Brian Cunningham at DC, which was quite a while ago, he and I started talking because we were just talking about comics. He really likes analyzing comics. He did this crazy thing. This is awesome. This crazy thing where he went back to the Paul Levitz run on Legion of Superheroes, and he mapped out all of the subplots, like kind of like on a chart of like when did the C plot become the A plot, and like how do they intersect? Like he did this like whole like analysis thing. It's fascinating, and I don't know if he'd want me to tell people that this exists, but it was super cool. And he just did it because he wanted to learn. Like he wanted to see like how did Paul do that when he was like 12? So we had our conversations weren't about looking for work or wanting to work together. Our conversations were very naturally just about comics and how they work and what's cool about them and all that sort of stuff. And eventually it morphed into wanting to work together. But yeah, I mean, once we started talking about working together, like the DC characters was like kind of like the last sort of thing that I hadn't had a chance to touch. And what was kind of funny is when I was talking with Brian originally, like what I said to him was, I don't really want to work on the big guys. Like I did a lot of that at Marvel. Like I like those characters and I'm sure I would love to tell a story from, but one of the things that I love doing is taking either a lesser known character or a character that maybe fell out of favor or got damaged and figuring out how to rebuild them.
Right.
You know, and that's a lot of what I did with Annihilation. It's what I did with Madrox and X Factor. It's what I did with, just staying in comics, what I did with G.I. Joe when we rebooted G.I. Joe and did G.I. Joe Cobra and, all this kind of stuff. And I had worked at Hasbro, the toy company, speaking of crazy, weird things that I've done. And that was my job at Hasbro, was taking their old IP and figuring out how to make it palatable and work today. Anyway, so I was more interested in like, give me your Blue Devils, give me your Firestorms, give me your Detective Chimps,
and Crime Syndicates.
And Crime Syndicates. And let me take the characters that nobody else really wants and let me figure out what makes them tick. And there, even in that zone, there are certain characters that I really want. Like I'd love to do Spectre. and Blue Devil, for whatever reason, when Blue Devil came out in the 80s, like I loved that character, loved Blue Devil. But that was sort of the thing. And so Brian kind of called me up and said, like, do you want to, I know you don't really want to work on the big stuff, but we have this opportunity. There's going to be a lot of stuff changing and there's kind of this open casting call, and I'd be really interested in working with you on something. So I wrote something like, I think it was like close to 30, short takes, short pitches, anywhere from like, maybe 2 paragraphs to maybe 3/4 of a page. I don't think any of them were longer than that because they weren't like fully fleshed out. Like, this is what the whole book is like, but just like kind of fresh takes on things. And so I had stuff in there that was like Challengers of the Unknown and like a new way to look at that, or the Forgotten Heroes. And, there was some bigger story. Like, here would be I think a really cool fresh take on Firestorm and what to do with him, and all that kind of stuff. So I did all of these things, and I guess he kind of told me this later, and I don't know how true it is, but I guess just the fact that I wrote that many and enough of them were good that and he passed them around, I think, to some of the other editors that like working with me became easier just to like get the approval.
Sure.
So then I had not pitched Crime Syndicate, and then he called me up and said, how do you feel about Crime Syndicate? And I was like, I feel great about Crime Syndicate, because that is like working with the big guns, because it's all the evil versions of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, but it doesn't come with all the fact that they've all got 4 series and I have to tie in with an event every 2 months. And so I was like, yeah, let's figure this out. And so I went in, and because they were going to be rebuilding the the multiverse, or what is it now, the Omniverse?
Omniverse, yeah, I think it is.
The Omniverse, yeah. That like we had an opportunity to do kind of a new take on them, and so I did some digging on it, and I realized that nobody had ever really done an origin story. Like so the original pitch was and it was originally going to be a mature reader's book, and it was going to be 12 issues with like 10-page backup story, like 22 lead story and 10-page backup stories, and that got whittled down because somebody at DC rightly said, Crime Syndicate books not gonna like so it became 6 issues, 18 pages up front, 4-page backup stories, a much more reasonable thing. But like, if they were willing to give me 30 pages an issue, like, hey, I'll take it. So obviously that causes changes, and we started morphing things, but yeah, so the idea was I wanted to craft the story of these evil jerks and how they would come together. Like, why would they get together, like, at all? And then why would they stay together? They're all evil jerks that backstab each other. So you have to come up with a cohesive reason, not just to get them together, because you can come up with like a earth-shattering event, right? Where, okay, well, the planet is going to die, and that's where all of them keep all of their stuff on Earth. So they all have a reason not to let the Earth explode. But then once that is defeated,
why do they stay together?
Why they stick together? Yeah. So the 6-issue miniseries is really is there is that overall kind of arc to it, but it is broken up into 2 3-issue arcs.
Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick second to give a shout out to Macroverse. Macroverse is an exciting digital comics platform that makes next-gen comics custom crafted for your phone. Macroverse's comics utilize its unique tap story format, which ensures this isn't a PDF on an iPad or an endless scroll, but a designed for mobile experience where every episode is crafted to take advantage of this one-of-a-kind style. Macroverse is curated for quality, with every series they publish being something they believe deserves to be read by a massive audience. Think of it like HBO for comics, with over 35 titles and 400 episodes from names like Brian Stelfreeze, Juan Doe, Paul Scheer, and more. Check out Macroverse today by downloading the app on iOS or Google Play, and get started with a rotating collection of free episodes, or unlock the entire universe for just $4.99 a month, with half of all profits going to the creators themselves. And now, back to the show. I do think it's really quick. I do think it's interesting how, they've never had an origin story, because I don't think for Crime Syndicate it's never really been necessary, because it's like their idea is so fundamentally simple. It's just like they're the bad version of characters you already know from Earth 3, and it's just like, what if they were bad? And
Right.
I have to admit, I'm gonna make you pitch me. I'm not normally a Crime Syndicate fan, because the whole I feel like the whole Justice League was evil thing only works for me situationally, and for the most part they're just kind of popped in events, or like they are an event like Forever Evil and stuff like that, and it never had the narrative tension I was looking for. I am interested, like, besides it just being an origin, like what makes this one different? Like, why? I guess maybe bringing in the origin, what makes this one stand out in a way that others, without you slandering other ones, haven't been able to like get to?
No, I think that's a valid question, and it's funny that you say like they come in events, because my introduction to them was the first issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths
Yeah.
in the 80s,
I think that was my first one too.
where they are doing exactly what I just said, which is the Earth is dying, and so they band together to try and fight it, and then then their Earth is just destroyed and they all die. But which is great though, because I remember like reading that, I had no idea who these characters were, but it was pretty clear that they were kind of evil, but then they did care about the planet itself, and then they were like dead, and I was like, the whole thing like happened so fast, I was just like, that's so cool, like who are those guys? But you're right, and so I think fundamentally what the and I'm not saying that all other Crime Syndicate stories are sort of a same piece, but what's different for me is that I don't want to tell a story about an evil Justice League. So part of my original pitch, this isn't something anybody would ever say, was at the end of this story, people shouldn't be coming back to read Crime Syndicate because they want to read about, evil Superman. They should come back to the story because they want to know what Ultraman is going to do next, and what is Superwoman going to do next, and what is Atomica going to do next.
Mm-hmm.
That if what we can accomplish in 6 issues is you stop thinking of them as evil versions of someone else, and you start thinking of them as themselves.
Right.
That's a pretty huge shift.
Yeah, that's massive.
And so I don't know that we accomplish it.
I'll be the judge of that, Andy.
But I think conceptually, because usually they are brought in as an event, and they are brought in as the evil version of these guys. And so there's a really interesting discussion that we had in with Earth 3 versions of some other characters, where I was like, yeah, I don't want to see Ultraman fight Alexander Luthor, because I can get that in Earth 1.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I want to see Ultraman fight something new or something different. And so it's no secret that the Starro is in the first issue. He's right there on the cover, so not doing any spoilers, but even our Starros are a little bit different.
Well, I mean, I have to imagine if like the inverse is true with the Justice League, that there might, Crime Syndicate as it may be, maybe the same is true with Starro. But I do want to point out really quick, I read another interview that you said that, or at least you suggested that people don't like Starro. That is false. Starro is awesome. I love Starro.
I don't think I suggested. I think I outright said it.
I like all the characters everyone hates. Like, man, I love Stiltman. Last night I was looking for Taskmaster's first appearance. Oh, man. Yeah, I'm all about it.
Do people hate Taskmaster?
I don't know.
They probably do.
Well, he's kind of a perma like B-list at most, and like if you think about his history, it's like the only time he's ever really been given an actual arc was like one mini series that Fred Van Lent and Hefty Paulo did, which was great. I really love that, and that's like the majority. It was great. It was 2010. People totally slept on it. Everyone read that Taskmaster miniseries. But yeah, I mean, it's just like a lot of these characters. It's not that they're bad characters. It's that they're never really given an opportunity to be more than what they're presented as in these like windows.
And I think that's very, very common. And I think that's also one of the reasons why kind of getting out of like an office where I'm just cranking out book after book after book, you can care more about some books than you do about others. And by care, I don't mean like, oh, I don't care about that book, but like you can dedicate more time to something to make it a little bit more special. And then there are other books that are just like, sometimes you just get to the point where you're like, at the end of the day, this thing just needs to go out the door. with minimal spelling errors. Like, and there's no way to avoid that because you can't give every book the attention you want. And that was one of the things that was a little bit different when I went over to IDW. I could give individual books, more attention. That doesn't mean that they're going to sell better because like there's just a limiting factor. There just aren't as many Transformers comics fans as there are X-Men comics fans, right? Like, but you could put that effort and so a friend of mine once told me that my comics career is a comics career in reverse because I started at Marvel and like on all these like
I can see that
are like being picked up and made into $1 billion movies, and then I quote unquote downgraded to IDW or working on licensed things, and then I'm doing creator owned stuff, and now like I do like my own things here and there, and I work in a lot of other places, but he says that very tongue in cheek, but it is true. Like I don't know that I would want to go back to a place like Marvel and DC and be an editor again because I get frustrated when I feel like characters get shortchanged. But I also understand that is the nature of the system.
Yeah, there can only be so many stars.
Right, but like Taskmaster is a character that I've always liked and always thought should be and could be a lot more, than he is. He's
God in the YouTube era. He can just watch anything on YouTube, and all of a sudden he's like a boss. He could be on like Top Chef and win it like instantaneously.
That would be pretty great. I think you just made a pitch, my friend.
That's my problem. Is I'm accidentally always pitching. I'm like, what if Stiltman had a Vision like maxi series that's about the legacy of why people keep taking Stiltman's like identity. It's a terrible identity and everyone wants it. Why? I need to know that story. I'm like, damn it, did I just pitch a comic?
Yeah. But going back to Crime Syndicate, that's sort of the approach I took to them is I want them to come across not as just sort of analogs of other characters, which is what they were originally built to be. So there's no shame in that and there's no need to hide from it. But, like just for examples, their status quos are a little bit different. I also did a fair amount of work to make sure that sort of their driving motivations were all sort of separated out because they have a tendency to get sort of glommed on as like, well, they're all just evil or whatever.
Right.
That's been a little less true in recent years. Forever Evil did differentiate them more. But we start off with their identities aren't all publicly known. Like the world doesn't know that there's a Superwoman out there. She is a like 7 foot tall ambassador from Demon's Island, and she lives it's Arnold DC in the Earth 3 instead of Washington DC because Benedict Arnold was the first president. But but she's like an ambassador from a foreign nation that happens to be Amazon warriors. The public doesn't know who Johnny Quick and Atomica are because he moves at super speed. So they've never seen him. Mm-hmm. So there's like all this crime and like stuff going on and they don't know what's happening because metahumans aren't even really known other than Ultraman. Ultraman is like sort of the one guy who's Ultraman, and he's been around in this universe since the 60s. And one of the little changes we made is that he's essentially immortal. And Owlman is a rumor.
Right.
So it's all like that kind of stuff. And so the first arc, one of the things that Starro does is Starro kind of blows the lid off of the fact that there's like metahumans there are a lot of them around. And so that sort of changes the face of the world, and causes these characters to come into conflict kind of with each other and with all this sort of stuff. And so, I think that approach is kind of fun, and it is sort of a flip on the original Justice League origin story, which involved Starro. Had I not been able to come up with a Starro story that I liked, then I wouldn't have used Starro, but I did. And the other thing that Starro allows, which I think is important, is you're not going to find Starro monologuing. And so with Starro, it just allows you to spend 18 out of 18 pages with, your core cast of characters.
Mhm.
So it became much easier to keep the focus on our 6 main characters instead of having to spend 3 or 4 pages an issue kind of dealing with what's Starro up to, what's his master plan, where's the twist on all that sort of stuff. Like we get to stick so that you get to know our characters a bit in those first 3 issues before it gets more complicated in the last 3 issues.
I do wonder, when I think of the Crime Syndicate, especially in 2021, to me, I feel like something like The Boys kind of primes the pump for them being more interesting because, The Boys, I mean, obviously it's enormously popular as a show, if not as much as a comic book. But I do think it's interesting to think about what whether these type of, superpowered people that are evil and have these powers is maybe more realistic than the usual heroes we see in stories, given the way that things normally work. I mean, I do find the Crime Syndicate to be like a kind of fitting group in 2021, perhaps even more so than the actual Justice League, which is kind of terrible, but at the same time, perhaps so. And I don't know. I mean, I do think it's interest. Like most times I'd probably be like, Crime Syndicate, get a book? I don't know about that. But now it's like, yeah, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, well, it is interesting. Like one of the reasons why it being a mature reader's title made sense to me is because there are things like The Boys that are out there.
Right.
And so like, okay, so I've got a bunch of evil guys, but we can't do the things that you can do over here in this thing that you already like. And so you just pivot, not that I was going to try and do all the same things that goes on in The Boys, but you just pivot and you shift your focus. Yeah. And there are definitely things I put in the script where they were like, yeah, we're not gonna do that.
Just you can have 1 beheading, not 7 beheadings.
I do get notes like that. Yes. I get notes that are like, can we just tone this down, or how much of this can happen off panel, and then you have to reevaluate, right? Well, if it happens off panel, is it still visceral? Is it still a good story element, or am I better off to change it to something that I can do on panel, so that your audience, the reader will feel it more. So you're talking about projects where you learn a lot. Like this is certainly one of them. Because I am trying to push a little. Like I don't want it to be totally off-putting. But yes, I mean, coming out of 2020, the worst year in history, and or one of them, and doing a book about a bunch of jerks is great. And one of the things that was really fun was figuring out like what are sort of those defining traits for these guys. And so Ultraman is this sort of paranoid titan, and how is he affected by being the only person? And what's great about doing the backup stories is that each of the 4-page backup stories, so Kieran McCowan, who's awesome, is doing the 18-page up front as the penciler, and then Brian Hitch is doing the 4-page backup stories. And all the backup stories are they're not origin stories per se, in the sense that like we don't really tell you like what did he do, what did Thomas Wayne do to become Owlman, but
their introductions.
But their introductions to those characters, I mean, they pretty much all take place in the past, and so they could be considered origin stories, and they are in the sense that their origins are similar to the Earth One components, but what we're really kind of trying to show you for the most part is where did it go wrong? Mm-hmm. Like what's that moment?
The fork in the road moment.
Yeah, where they chose evil, right? Or they reacted to something differently, and that changed the course of their lives, which was really fun to do. But in order to do that, I had to figure out like what's the driving thing about each one of these characters, and it really forces you to focus on what is it about this character that's driving them and that sort of thing. And I read a bunch of Crime Syndicate stuff, but I will tell you that my favorite version of the Crime Syndicate is Crisis on Two Earths, the animated film written by Dwayne McDuffie, mm-hmm. which I love. And so there is a fair amount of influence from that, primarily in Ultraman and Owlman. You'll see shades of, if you're familiar with that, you'd see shades from there. But so I'm happy to sort of pick up on stuff that other people have done and use it, and hopefully anybody that has worked on those things will feel good about that and not feel like I'm ripping them off. That's certainly not my intent. But yeah, the backup stories are really fun for that reason, to drill down on them and show like where does the twist happen, because I think that's part of what is interesting about Earth 3, but it's also going back to my earlier point, that's also what makes him not Superman, right? That's what makes Ultraman and not Superman. That's what makes him Owlman and not Batman, and that's pretty fun. And again, driving to that purpose, if you get to the end of these 6 issues and hopefully you want to read about the Crime Syndicate, you don't want to read about evil Justice League anymore.
Well, and you look at something like Superman Red Sun. I mean, at least like in part the reason why you care about this like evil version of Superman is because you get those inciting moments that leads him to where he is. And like, you get that whole path, and like it is, I do think that type of stuff is both humanizing, but also like just fascinating to see. And it's something that's kind of always like crime. I guess maybe that's part of the reason why I was never really a big fan of Crime Syndicate, is they always felt like evil without purpose. And they never really felt like they had their like reason to exist beyond like, isn't this a cool idea? And I know that's rich coming from somebody who is just like, Stiltman should have more comics about him. But but at the same time, I just have a couple more questions, though. I do want to ask about Earth 3 in particular, because it is interesting. I think this launches the same day as Infinite Frontier #0. So like you have this whole launching point where it's like, this is like the Omniverse. This is like the new thing. Is that like... Is establishing what Earth 3 is in this new world order a significant part of what you do, or is that really just kind of like the environment you exist in?
It depends on what you mean by establishing what it is in this new world order. If what you mean is, are you trying to build a book that sort of defines the world, then the answer to that is yes.
Oh, that is pretty much what I was asking. So thank you.
So, yeah. So, but just to clarify what I mean by that is, in a way, I am not just writing a book about these 6 characters. I am writing a book about the world of Earth 3.
Right.
Right. So, and you can do that if you're writing the only book in Earth 3. I can blow up, I can blow up a city if I want, because there's not another person writing and illustrating a book that takes place in Central City, right? Like I can do those sorts of things. I can kill off characters if we want or need to, right? So, but as I was saying about the Starro and this is the story of, yes, this is definitely the story that focuses on these Crime Syndicate characters, but we are teasing out things about the world, and hopefully when you're reading it, you're not super drawn. You're not like distracted by some of the things that we do, but we leave a lot of breadcrumbs there for you to kind of figure out some things like in the background. I'll give you an example. So spoiler alert here. But I think it's in issue 2, the first time we see the Owl's Nest where Owlman is, underneath the floor of the owl nest, he's like walking around on like this glass floor, and underneath the floor are these dead foes of his. And so you can, it's kind of fun. You can pick them out and go, oh, that's the Earth 3 version of this. That's the Earth 3 version of that. But it also helps tell this story about like how long Owlman has been around and what he's been up to and all this sort of stuff. So we do build out the world beyond just like, what are these 6 guys doing?
Right.
On a Tuesday, and we have some stuff that takes place in, there's a lot of like cameos where it's like, we'll cut away to something else for like a panel, and you'll see this character, you'll see that character. And it's funny too, because I just recently, years ago, I started a Twitter account that was @Comic Experience because I was running Comics Experience, and that has since just sort of like morphed into like not my personal account. It's we still do tongue-in-cheek stuff and all the stuff on that Twitter account, but I just recently, like maybe 2 months ago, started my own personal account again. So I'm now @39A Andy. So it's 2 A's in a row, 39A Andy. and it's been kind of funny how many people, have just been asking like, so does this Earth 3 character are they in it? Are they in it? And like, there are real fans for like all of
Oh
these
yeah,
characters, which I did not realize how popular, Sea King is. But he's popular.
there's a fan for everyone. And it never ceases to amaze me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's one fan for Stiltman.
Whatever.
Uh,
There's
but
hordes of us. Legions.
legions of them. But it's yeah, I mean, it's we are trying to build we are trying to build out the world, but we're also trying to build out what Earth 3 is and means, so that if somebody wants to do a story in Earth 3, they should be able to read our series, hopefully even just the first issue, honestly, and get, oh, okay, that's what Earth 3 is. So if I'm going to do a story about the Earth 3 version of this character, or just create a new character in Earth 3, this is the thing that we need to have. And for me, it's I either call it the twist or the flip. I call it the flip because a twist I think of as like a narrative, like misdirection thing or whatever. But like the flip on each of these characters is what I've been calling it when I'm talking with my editors and stuff. Mm-hmm. Like what is the thing that flipped this character into this other thing? And that goes for evil characters that are actually good too. So I think you should be able to read this comic, and that doesn't mean that anybody is beholden. I mean, look, I've been doing this a long time, and I know that when my 6 issues are done, chances are the next person that does a Crime Syndicate story is going to need the Crime Syndicate to function however they need to function for their story, and that's fine. They don't have to follow up on mine. They don't have to use the same character designs. They don't have to do those things. That's kind of how comics work.
Well, it's the beauty of it being an origin too, though, is like it can go from anywhere from here. Like they could jump 10 years and all of a sudden they're, I don't know, completely different.
Right. Yeah. And there is this sort of like there's this tug of war in the shared universe, superhero comics, of continuity being important versus continuity being a thing that's good, but like can tie you down creatively. And my sort of guiding light on that is I want to be consistent with the characters as they have appeared before as much as possible. But I don't need to either constantly be referencing older stories, or if somebody's telling stories about characters that I had the chance to contribute to, I don't need those people to be like, as seen in Crime Syndicate number 4.
Right.
But it would be nice if they resemble to some degree, like the version that we wrote. But if not, that's fine too. Like that's just the nature of the business. And if things aren't changing or growing or getting a fresh take, then what's not happening? They're not changing or growing or getting a fresh take, and that's probably not great. Like they need to be evolving and that sort of thing. So anytime I'm working on anything that's work for hire, like I don't get precious about it. I want to do a good job. I take my job very seriously, and I want to have a lot of fun doing it. But I don't.
The rules of it. You know the way it works. Okay. Well, let's close with a big question about your future. You have a million hats. We've talked about it. Writing is perhaps, I don't know if it's more of a hat than it has been in the past, but it's, you're out there, you're doing, miniseries at DC, you're doing things like that. Do you see more writing in your future, or do you think it's always going to be something that is a balance with your multitude of other roles?
This is a guess, but my guess is that it will probably be a balance. And the reason for that is, I mean, it's pretty simple. I'm a husband and a father, and my other businesses are much more stable in terms of providing for my family and that kind of thing. Whereas freelance writing is great. Like I really do enjoy it, and I don't take jobs that I think I'm not going to enjoy. But there is a difference between going, okay, I wake up in the morning and I have, on Monday, and I have a full week's worth of work to do, and I know what that is, versus, okay, I've got one more issue of a thing to write, and then I need to find a video game, or I need to get on a TV, I need to get a TV gig or a producing gig, or I need to get a whatever. Like for me, all of the sort of things that we think of as sort of freelance work, And I'm not moving. I'm not going to be moving to Los Angeles, even if I started doing a ton more TV work. Like we're happy where we are. This is where we want to raise our kids and everything. And so,
No bourbon in LA.
yeah, they don't have bourbon there.
It's embarrassing.
Yeah, they don't have anything there. They don't have rain like we have here. I'll tell you that. But yeah, so I have things that I also love too. Like I love teaching and I love running comics experience. And I don't know that love is the right word with the printing business, but I find it really interesting, and it allows me to like we were saying, talk and meet with other people that I really enjoy. So I really enjoy working on that too. And there are other things I do, and I enjoy the consulting stuff, but it's just, putting all my eggs in that basket, as I'm trying to save money so my kids can go to college or can go to a trade school or do whatever it is that seems appropriate when they get to the point where they're getting out of high school. It seems like, at least right now, not the right time. But so I imagine that just because I don't have the time to sort of track down a ton of this freelance writing stuff, I imagine that comics writing in particular, which also pays less, will probably not like become like my main thing.
Totally understandable.
But I have really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
I'd be happy to do more, but it probably won't be like a focus for me from like a career perspective. But there are conversations that are taking place, and I don't know if any of them will necessarily pan out. DC is just a really tough spot because they lost a lot of their staff, which means projects that were with those people that are no longer there are now on the people that are there. So they had pretty much a full workload before, and now they've got other things put on top of that. So it's if a company has an initiative and they call you, that's one thing. But if it's, right now, I think trying to pitch stuff at DC, that you want to do is probably pretty hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes sense that you'd want to balance it all out because the life of a freelancer is inherently unpredictable. And so if you can have some level of predictability worked in there and then maybe have some of that unpredictability on the periphery, that makes sense. And I don't know. I mean, after doing all this stuff for so long, I don't know. I don't want to say you'd get bored, but I wouldn't say you wouldn't not get bored.
Yeah, I don't think I'm ever bored. I'm not always fully entertained.
I mean, if you did just one role, if you were if you work in an ad agency, for example, you'd probably be like, what the hell am I doing?
Right. Well, I certainly would be, because I just struggle doing the same thing. And, it was my wife when I was at Hasbro, which I went to Hasbro after IDW. And when I was at Hasbro, my wife was the one that just like sat me down one night. And she was like, you know what, like you shouldn't do any more corporate jobs, like where you're on staff and you're in the corporate structure and all that. She was just like, that's just not you. It was me. And it's just not me anymore. At that time, like, it's just not you. Like I'm more of an entrepreneur now, which is like, I think you said it earlier. Like I never would have thought I would be an entrepreneur when I was, in high school or in college. Like I had no interest in starting a business, and now I've started 5. And
you're addicted.
I do enjoy it. Yeah. I need the juice. But I'm also interested in writing, creator-owned stuff. And those projects tend to be smaller and they're more personal, and I don't have the pressure of feeling like they need to sell huge, like, to justify my existence. It'd be great if they sold, but like, it's okay if they don't, because that's not why I'm doing all of those things.
Yeah.
And stuff that I write that's mine, I own.
Yeah.
And I can go visit LA and I can, get an option on it or whatever. So it stays with you longer. I don't have to ask people for permission. Like I don't have to ask people if I can write up my own creator-owned book. I can just do it.
You can behead as many people as you want.
That's right. I behead people all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know. It's balancing all those things, and there's a lot of wasted time. And this isn't unique to comics. I mean, there's just a lot of wasted time and churning and burning on like pitching stuff and all that sort of stuff that winds up going nowhere. And that's part of the business. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's a reality, and I take that into account too. So I'm having a lot of fun while I'm here doing it. And if DC, the book comes out and there's a good reaction, then DC might, want to call me up and say, let's do some more. But if they don't, that's okay. It's not going to end my world. I'm proud of the book. I think Kieran's really proud of the book too. It's great to have Dexter Vines ink in the book. He had some major health issues, and so it's great to have him back working in comics. Brian Hitch is doing some awesome work, and Steve Olive and Alex Sinclair, both colorists I never worked with when I was at Marvel, and that I have always wanted to work with, and they're both on this book. Like, it's fantastic. And Rob Lee is doing more work than he should on lettering. I'm sorry, Rob.
Well, I hope it ends up being, I hope you have a great time with it. I hope whatever comes next, there's a lot of it, but knowing you, there will be. But Andy, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Crime Syndicate, your career, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, David.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Andy Schmidt. You can find Schmidt on Twitter and his work in Crime Syndicate at DC Comics. Love Off Panel and want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating and review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content and its members-only forum. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow on Twitter at SketchComic or following me at @SlicedFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Zach Thompson, Bradley Roeder, Carl Choi, Megan Marsden, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Barra, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Antonio Offen, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Scotty Young, Susanna Polo, Jeff Weir, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pacello, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Top, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Slade, Sakil Wilson, Alex Demetriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Leona Kingas, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Ranwa, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Braldy, Nick Hull, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Chris Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.